institutions in and out from 13, 14, 15 years of age. And there was a lovely quote in this film because it actually said, a couple of them said, oh, we didn't know we could leave. And that was the power of the institution to actually affect your capacity to actually imagine that you could leave. You don't need bars and rails and locks on doors, because if people don't even think of the possibility that they could live a life other than the one that they're living, they're not going to want those expectations. They're not going to say, am I getting better? What is the program that you're running for me? So I think that those kinds of conversations are really important to keep alive, particularly if we're looking at the issue of, well, oh, sorry, mate, we haven't got enough money to go around. We have to start building these large warehousing facilities. Yeah. You know, the civil rights movement was significant because obviously mentoring and role models are very, very significant. This picks up on my theme of the capacity to imagine something different. And to be hopeful about change. I mean, you're talking about people living in very depressing realities, you know, where they're told day after day, you can't do this. So I think the civil rights movement, even if it was about other groups, you know, people of colour, women, gays and lesbians, for example, it showed, well, if they can do this, maybe we can do some of this. So I think there's an inspiration there. But the core to the civil rights movement was about marginal groups gathering together, sharing fellowship, probably sharing a bit more if I might add, but this is not an R-rated movie. But, you know, really having a sense of a similar lived experience and talking that through. We need to remember that when it comes to people with disabilities, because in the 80s and 90s, and hopefully not so much now, there was the dominant philosophy of normalisation and SRV, which talks about separating people with disabilities from each other, which talks about the fact of moving people with disabilities into other culturally valued roles in the community. The reality is that, you know, even if people survived institutions because of resilience, because of good character, but because of the mates that they were in with, and in fact the strong bonds of friendship that were formed, for better or worse. You know, it's a bit like the inmate reality. And in terms of civil rights then, it's about people with disabilities coming together and saying, what are our common experiences? And sometimes people with disabilities have common experiences across differences in disability. And I think that's a really important thing. The other thing is role model and mentoring. And again, you look at the civil rights movement, beautiful examples of leadership. Beautiful examples of corrupt leadership too. You know, what happens when power goes to the head of people who traditionally haven't had power? And there's some examples and lessons to be learnt there. People with disabilities traditionally haven't had power. So what happens when you get that really quickly? What kinds of leadership training needs to take place? And again, the mentoring is important. You know, agencies themselves, I think, should be showcasing their service users as examples of success stories, of achievement. I think we need to celebrate achievement a lot more in agencies. I think the other thing about the civil rights movement, I mean, I think it was a good thing, but I think we put all our efforts and our hopes and dreams in laws. We thought if we got the right laws, the anti-discrimination laws, the correct laws for funding of services, all would be well. And to some extent that was good, and I think, you know, human rights laws are important. However, in the Australian context, we know that it's easy to, and it happened in the 90s under the Howard regime, to actually weaken those laws, to actually change the structure and nature of those laws. I mean, you look at the Disability Discrimination Act as one example, and I won't go into it in a lot of detail. But it's based on what's called an individual complaints-based system, which means, Alan, you could go along one week with a particular complaint, have your situation resolved, maybe you're discriminated against in the workplace. I could go along the next week with exactly the same complaint, have my situation resolved. But it's such an individualised, privatised thing. What would be better is to have a sense of what are the common experiences and how can we work on more collective change. And how do we actually log these trends? And I kind of wonder with a lot of these civil rights changes, what they were on about was trying to transform society's values and society's ethos. I think in many ways in the disability area, and particularly because of this normalisation theory, a lot of the emphasis was on getting people with disabilities to fit into and embrace mainstream culture, whatever that is, and that's an interesting question in itself, and assimilate. We never use that word, but to assimilate. And we know with the experience of Indigenous Australians that is a policy that's bound to fail. Instead, I think our challenge for the future is to try and work on changing cultural attitudes towards how it understands concepts of difference. You know, how it understands and celebrates there's different ways people can think and be creative. There are different ways that people can have some kind of emotional input into the community. There are different forms of, the whole body image issue. I read something on the weekend that they said the marketing agencies are trying to get girls to think in one colour. So pink, 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 not multiple colours, and the whole issue of socialisation is a really important issue about how we actually value different forms of difference, different forms of body type, etc., etc. So I think, part of our work is transforming values. And I think the whole role of non-government organisations in assisting leadership training for people with disabilities is one way of moving into that area. I think the other thing is to showcase examples of where people with quite significant disabilities, I didn't use severe, I don't like that word, but significant disabilities where people think that, well, maybe not much can come of that life, to show examples where in small ways but significant ways people with disabilities can make contributions. One thing we've learnt, hopefully from the terrible things that have happened in human history, is human beings are very, very resilient and have the capacity to transform their lives in very, very small ways. So again, whether that be through media, there's a lovely film at the moment called The Diving Bell and Butterfly, which is about a man with locked-in syndrome. He blinks with one eye. It's based on a true story. He wrote the book and then died 2 weeks later. But, and it's been made into a film, this book, and it's about the rich interior life, the power of memory, the power of reflection, the power of being able to contribute a human existence in a different way. And this was from a man who can only blink. He cannot move one single other bit of his body. And, often people will often make judgments. Is this a life worth living? And I think that films like that, for example, can show the general public that there is worth and value and the capacity to contribute. Yeah. At the same time, we're having an emerging self-help movement, and I'll just explain what that was. The self-help movement in New South Wales and Victoria in particular often was made up of small voluntary groups of people, maybe groups of 10, 20, 30, 40 people, who often came together for multiple reasons. Often it was what I call support and whinge sessions to talk about the common experiences of coping with a situation. Some of those groups moved to a second stage once they became aware of their own conditions and developed a sense of consciousness, then looked at social change and social action. What a lot of those groups then started doing is that they started applying for funding. They had been unfunded. So we, at one stage, I can remember working for an organisation called the Collective of Self-Help Groups, very long names back then, COSH, and we had a directory, and we produced a directory of self-help groups in Victoria alone, and there would have been about 500 or 600 of these groups. I should say to you also was an era where there were a number of establishment agencies who were happy doing business in the old style, providing sheltered workshops, providing employment conditions where people earned 50 cents a day. I think it's important to remember those circumstances where there were no award wages, where there was no trade union protection. And of course there were institutions that still weren't providing basic necessities of life. Proper food, proper diets, access to medical treatment, etc. A lot of those organisations were very threatened by the Disability Services Act when it came into being, and by the Handicaps Programs Review. They still believe that it was immoral almost to enable people with disabilities to take risks. One of the phrases at the time was dignity of risk, to take opportunities. A lot of those organisations felt that people with disabilities had to be protected. Some of those people actually actively opposed the change process. I think on the other side of the counter with service providers were getting very annoyed with constantly being knocked back when coming up with innovative projects, wanting to come up with independent living projects, wanting to come up